Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to speak about the topic of Palestine as an intrinsic part of Sham, the Sham region, Bilad al-Sham, Barr al-Sham. It has many names. Usually when we talk about Zionism, we tend to focus on how the Zionist movement severed the Palestinian tie to Palestine, naturally. I think we tend to forget how the Zionist movement severed Palestine from Bilad al-Sham, from the greater region of Sham, what is today Palestine, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and even parts of Turkey, and even parts of Saudi Arabia. When I was doing dissertation research, I spent many years trying to track down every usage of the word Philistine in the Arabic historical record. I'm glad I chose Philistine rather than Sham, because my dissertation would have been a hell of a lot longer. And that's because Palestine has always been considered part of, a constitutive part of, this greater region. And I'm not going to bore you with all of the Arabic historians, geographers, and writers in history who would have considered Palestine a part of Bilad al-Sham. But this is the case, of course, with Baladhuri's Futuh al-Buldan, a very famous work on the Islamic conquests. This is the case with Al-Muqaddisi's Ahsan al-Taqasim, perhaps the most famous 10th century Arabic geographer. This is also the case with Ibn Hawqal, who wrote one of the most famous works of geography known as Surat al-Arid. This is, of course, the case with Yaqut al-Hamawi. He wrote a very famous encyclopedia known as Mu'jam al-Buldan. They all identify Palestine as part of Sham. And this is true well into the 19th century as well. So we have a Lebanese writer, Asad Kayat. He's writing in English in the 19th century. And he says in 1847, quote, "First we begin with the general name of the country. It is called Barr al-Sham, or the country of Sham." Perhaps the most famous 19th century Egyptian scholar, his name was Rifa al-Tahtawi. He wrote many books, many manuscripts, spent a good number of years in France, came back to Egypt and wrote a manuscript that is sitting today in Dar al-Kutub in Cairo. It's called Geographiat Bilad al-Sham. And you have a good 3-4 pages in that book on Philistine. This is, of course, also the case with the two most important books written on the history of Syria in the 19th century. You have Yusuf Dibiz, writes a book on Tariq Suriya, and you have also Jurjiyani. He also writes a book on Tariq Suriya in the 19th century, and both books include long sections on Palestine. As late as 1911, the Palestinian newspaper Palestine, published in Jaffa by the Isa cousins, they published an article in which they describe Gaza as part of Syria, and they even describe it on the Sawahil Suriya, right? So Gaza is on the Syrian coast. And well into the 1920s, okay, so after the colonial division of Bilad al-Sham, you have many geographers and writers and historians who continue to speak of Palestine and as part of Sham, and continue to conflate parts of Palestine as if they were parts of Syria. And I'll just give one or two quick examples. So the first would be Sabri Sharif Abdul Hadi's Geographiat Suriya wal Palestine al-Tabi'iyya, published in 1923. It's a fascinating book. I write about it in my MA thesis. And he's talking about Marj ibn Amr, which is the Jezreel Valley. It's you might call it the north of Palestine. He includes it in a section on Syria. Okay? And then he also just seamlessly moves back and forth in another section between El Carmel or Haifa, Jaffa, and then back to Antakya and the coastal plains of Syria. Another great example would be Said al-Sabbagh, who is probably the most important Palestinian geographer during the Mandate period. He published a dozen-some works of geography during the period. And again, he also will casually mention the Bisan Valley, and the Dead Sea, in discussions of Damascus and the Hauran. And I think what I would take away from just this very terse survey of how Arabs, Muslims, Palestinians, Syrians talk about Syria and Palestine, they talk about Syria and Palestine as constitutive parts of Bilad al-Sham. Now, moving beyond the realm of ideas into the realm of reality, Palestine and Syria were intimately linked, of course, in the late Ottoman period, and there are many volumes of many libraries and volumes of books have been written on this, so we don't need to spend too much time on this, but just state a few quick points here. So Palestinians imported many works, publications, journals, newspapers from Damascus and Beirut. These were you could call them the cultural, intellectual hubs of the Arab East. They also published in newspapers in Damascus and Beirut and Cairo. Nablusi merchants exported cotton, soap, olive oil, and textiles to Damascus. They also imported silks, textiles, copper, luxury items from Damascus. Seasonal agricultural workers from the Hawran would work in the ports in Jaffa. They would harvest the wheat in the Galilee. Politically, of course, if you were sitting in Haifa, in Nazareth, in Safad, in Tiberias, in 1911 or 1912 or 1913, you reported to either Beirut or Damascus, not Jerusalem. Right? If you look at the administrative maps of the late Ottoman period, the Mutasarrif League of Jerusalem only goes about as north as somewhere between Nablus and Jerusalem. But if you're in Nablus, your governor isn't sitting in Damascus. If you're in the Galilee, you report into Beirut, and that was the case up until 1917. And I want to shift to talking about what happened in this moment, 1918 to 1920, when, as our previous speaker noted, the Emir Faisal, the son of the Sharif Hussein of Mecca, revolts against the Ottoman Empire, establishes a kingdom in Damascus, and for the first time in 400 years, you have Arab rule in the Levant. There's Arabs ruling over Arabs. And I think this kingdom is generally understood to be an Arab kingdom. Maybe even sometimes it's called a Syrian kingdom. I think it would be better known as a Palestinian kingdom. I think the best way to understand that kingdom is that the rank and file of that administration was Palestinian. Nope, this is not well appreciated. This is not well known. But the head of the chief police of Damascus, Muhammad Ali Bey al-Tamimi, was from Nablus. The chief gendarme, basically the chief police of the Faisal regime was Subhi al-Khadra. He was from Safad. Salim Abdurrahman al-Hajj was from Tulkarm. He led the Arab Club of Damascus, which played an important role in that regime. Muhammad Izzat Darwaza, perhaps one of the most famous politicians during the Mandate period. He is a pan-Arabist from Nablus. He's the Minister of Education and later the Minister of Finance under Faisal. Aouni Abdel Hadi, another extremely important Palestinian from Nablus, he served as the private secretary and chief political advisor to King Faisal himself. Okay? We haven't mentioned Isa al-Isa, who is the editor of the newspaper Palestine. By the way, he also plays a role in this government. And we also have evidence that Haj Amin al-Husseini passed through Damascus during this period and also played a role, as did Arif al-Arif, who was later one of the most important leaders in the educational department under the British Mandate. He also played a role in that government. I mean, you're talking about the who's who of Palestinian political leaders, intellectual leaders from 1920 to 1948. They're all in Damascus during this period. And that's not a coincidence. It's because many of them fled Palestine during the war years. And they took refuge in Damascus. Because why wouldn't they take refuge in Damascus? This was all one region. This was all part of the same geographical, cultural, intellectual, political space. And of course, the Syrian National Congress itself had a Palestinian contingent. That included Muhammad Darwaza, who went back to Palestine and founded the Istiqlal Party in the 1930s, which advocated for unity between Palestine and Syria. It was actually long beyond that 2-year period that Palestinians continued to advocate for unity between Syria and Palestine. And so I think the point I want to end on, the last point I want to make here is that this connection transcended 1920 and continued well into the 1930s. And if you look at who were the major resistance leaders during the Mandate period, I would mention two people, neither of whom are actually from Palestine. The first would be Fawzi al-Qawqji. He's from Tripoli, which is in Lebanon. He first fought with the Ottomans. Then he fought against the French in the Great Syrian Revolt in 1925 to 1927. And then where did he wind up in the 1930s? He wound up in Palestine. And he recruited about 200 fighters and took part in the Great Arab Revolt from 1936 to 1939, perhaps the most longest lasting and significant of any anti-colonial revolt in all of colonial history. He had about 200 fighters and he operated in the Nablus, Tulkarm, and Jenin region. And then perhaps the most famous Palestinian resistance leader of all, Izzeddin al-Qassam. Where was he from? He was not from Palestine.
Syria.
Very good. Wow, I can't believe you knew that. Very impressive. So yeah, he's born in Syria, in part of the Ottoman province of Syria. He fought for the Ottomans during World War I. He winds up in Haifa after the war. And he's a preacher. He's a sheikh. He's building a following, preaching in Haifa, especially among the landless Palestinian farmers who were uprooted from their villages. About 10, 20,000 of them were uprooted in the 1920s when the Zionists bought land from the Sarsouk family in the Jezreel Valley and uprooted many thousands of Palestinians from that area. Many of them wound up in Haifa, were recruited by and joined Izzeddin al-Qassam and joined his and he organized these fighters in cells of 5 people each. And you might even say that when he was martyred in 1935, he was killed by British forces when he was surrounded by the British. And you could say his death was one of the key reasons Palestinians rose up in 1936. Right? There were thousands and thousands of people at his funeral. He was considered a martyr. He fought for Palestine, even though he was from Syria. And you might say that was one of the key factors that led to the outbreak of the Great Revolt in 1936. And I think on that note, it's telling that even today you see the resistance to Israel. The armed resistance, of course, doesn't just come from Palestine, right? You have armed resistance factions all around the region, and that that tendency has echoes all the way back in the Mandate period. Thank you so much for your time.